one in April and one in May, and by then we will have had covered, I would say, the most of the topics that were written about in the primer. This meeting, like all our previous meetings on the primer, is chaired by Robin Wright, who you know her, and there is no need for me to introduce her, except that she is trying to put the last words on her upcoming book, which I would just say, Rock the Casbah. It's a very exciting and very interesting and very timely book. It's about how street vendors, sheikhs, rappers, and women are shattering the old order. And we will be hopefully the first institution to have a big book launch for her here. Robin is currently a USIP Wilson Center distinguished scholars, and you know her from all her past and recent appearances on various TV stations, and she has been a wonderful colleague and friend at for us at the Wilson Center. Just to give you an example, she works the whole night. She takes maybe a 2-hour in the just to the center to chair a meeting. She'll be back again tomorrow chairing a meeting for us. So, Robin, you have the floor, and I'd like also to extend a special welcome to our 3 speakers and acknowledge the presence of the chairman of the Board of Trustees of the Wilson Center, Ambassador Gildenhorn, who is a supporter of the Middle East program. Thanks for coming, Robbie.
Thank you very much. And let me welcome you to our latest session on Iran at a very, very timely juncture, given what's happening across the Middle East today. We have 3 quite extraordinary speakers. Before I make their introductions, I think you have a write-up about each one in front of you. Let me just mention that the Iran Primer is not just a book, it's also a living website. And we've done something that's quite novel in terms of trying to educate the public about controversial issue like Iran. We set up a website. The website's very simple, iranprimer.com. It has the entire book on it, but we also have one of the 50 authors post a new piece every 2 days on an issue that is topical at the time. We've had some really extraordinary pieces that have been widely picked up across the internet. And I think Afshin is doing one this week as we see how Bahrain becomes the new battle zone between Iran and Saudi Arabia, and kind of the battle, little island becoming the flashpoint in the Persian Gulf. And Mike is doing another piece on looking at the lessons of Iraq and Iran's engagement there for the broader picture. So the book, so the website is constantly updating what's available in the book. And I'm quite proud of the fact that we have 50 experts who came together for this project from 20 think tanks, 8 universities, there are 2 former weapons inspectors, and the top U.S. official in charge of Iran from the past 6 administrations, all the way back to the 1979 revolution, looking at the issue of what happened between Iran and the United States during their watch. So it really is comprehensive, and we tried very hard to make sure that half of the writers, half of the authors are from the region. So it's not just, Western analysts and pundits talking about that part of the world. It's people who come from that part of the world as well. So we're going to look at 3 different issues in terms of Iran's foreign policy today. Oh, yes. Holly says, it's given me an instruction to please turn off your cell phones because it interferes with the transmission. This is being webcast live. Includes me. Sorry. Anyway, We're going to begin with Afshin Molavi. Afshin and I go back a long way. Afshin was a correspondent for Reuters in the Persian Gulf, and he's obviously of Iranian descent, and he is going to talk this morning about Iran and the Gulf and take a look at what the challenges are, what the relationship is, what the flashpoints are, and kind of set the stage. And as I said, it's particularly timely in light of the fact that Saudi Arabia deployed 1,000 troops in Bahrain yesterday, which has led to a very serious reaction from Tehran this morning. And then Mark is going to look at the issue of Russia and Iran, and I hope frame a little bit some of the issues on sanctions and the obstacles we face, because in light of the fact that diplomacy has not moved, one of the next big issues is what other mechanisms are there to squeeze. And of course, Iran, or the United States and Russia have very different visions about how far the international community should go. And so he's going to explore the dynamic of Iran and Russia. And then Mike is going to look at the issue of the Iraq experience and the lessons, again, about the balance of power in the region, right? Yeah. Okay. Well, let me turn it over, first of all, to Afshin, and each one will speak, 10, 15 minutes maximum, and then we want to open it up to questions so that this is a dialogue as well. Afshin?
Great. Thank you, Robin. It's really a pleasure to be here at the Wilson Center. The Wilson Center was my first think tank home, so it's good to be home. It's good to be with Haleh Esfandiari and the team, and it's been a pleasure to work on the Iran primer. I think that Robin always brings tremendous insight to her own analysis of the region, but I think her real victory here was herding 50 academics to deliver papers on time, you know. What I'm going to do is talk about Iran and the Persian Gulf region as a whole. Obviously, we have the headline out of Bahrain, but what I'd like to do before I get into Bahrain is go back to an episode of just a few months ago. At risk of beating a dead horse, let me reintroduce WikiLeaks. The WikiLeaks cables, we've read them, we've looked at them, we've talked about them ad nauseum, but there's one aspect of the whole WikiLeaks affair that I think has not gotten enough attention, and it has been Iran's reaction to the WikiLeaks cables. As you recall, remember when the first trove of documents came out? The headline from those first trove of documents were all Gulf Arab leaders encouraging the United States, pushing the United States to take military action on Iran, to take a much tougher line on Iran. You remember the quotes. The King of Abdullah was quoted as saying, King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia was quoted as saying by the Saudi ambassador that the head of the snake must be cut off. The Crown Prince of the United Arab Emirates was quoted using some very aggressive language regarding Iran. The King of Bahrain, the same. Now, this might have been a perfect opportunity for Mahmoud Ahmadinejad to thump his chest. It might have been a good opportunity for the IRGC, Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, to send some boats close to the Persian Gulf coast of the Emirates or Bahrain. But they did none of the above. In fact, when Ahmadinejad was asked about the WikiLeaks cables, which exposed in many ways, it was probably one of the worst kept secrets for those of us who've been following this stuff, that it wasn't shocking to us to find out that the Gulf Arab states were frustrated with Iran and urging the United States to take tougher action on Iran. But his response was, basically, I'm paraphrasing, these cables, this WikiLeaks affair, is a Zionist Western plot to sow disunity among Iran's brotherly Arab neighbors. Now, again, as you all know, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is not necessarily a man that's prone to sober statements. So the fact that he used a sober statement here, he did not engage in any sort of saber rattling here, is significant. So what was that all about? In many ways, this was a culmination of 21 years of Iran's foreign policy towards its Persian Gulf Arab neighbors. Beginning in 1989, with the presidency of Hashemi Rafsanjani, who entered the presidency by saying, you know what, we ought to stop making enemies around the world. And after he made that statement, we started to see the very first stirrings of an outreach to Iran's Arab neighbors in the Gulf region. Now, what is important about this is that you recall the 1980s. In the 1980s, Iran was actively involved in fomenting unrest in the Persian Gulf. They were actively involved in both supporting Shiite opposition groups in places like Bahrain and Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, and egging on protests whenever they took place. For some light reading, go to Ayatollah Khomeini's last will and testament. And you will find that in that last will and testament, he reserved some of his most vitriolic scorn for the Al Sauds of Saudi Arabia. He was even quoted once as saying, in the height of the Iran-Iraq war, that he would forgive Saddam Hussein before he ever forgave Saudi Arabia. And this was, in reaction to the 1987 incident in Mecca, in which Saudi security forces fired on Iranian pilgrims that were engaging in their usual protests against the United States during the Hajj pilgrimage. This had been a source of tension for several years. The Saudis did not want the Hajj, the religious pilgrimage, to be politicized. Eventually, Saudi security forces fired and 275 Iranians died. There were riots in Tehran. The Saudi embassy was attacked. I mean, this was serious problems that these countries had. Saudi Arabia and Kuwait largely underwrote Saddam Hussein's battle with Iran. There was a famous quote in which King Fahd was quoted as saying to Saddam Hussein, "You provide the rijal," means men, will provide the rials, and so this was a very serious conflict. And yet, literally, a year after Ayatollah Khomeini's, his grave was still warm, Iran began reaching out to Saudi Arabia through Hashemi Rafsanjani's presidency. And the key event that occurred at that time was Iraq's invasion of Kuwait in 1990. And Iran's subsequent position of what has been called active neutrality, in which Iran did not take a position, and therefore, in a sense, was seen as, many of the Gulf Arab leaders thought that maybe Saddam Hussein is actually the real threat to us, and maybe Iran is not such a significant threat. And we saw this flurry of diplomatic activity between the two sides. Now, ultimately, this culminated in the 1997 through 2001 period, which was the real honeymoon of Iran-GCC relations. This was President Mohammad Khatami's era. I remember I was in Tehran, Robin, you'll appreciate this, in December of 1997 during the Organization of Islamic Conference Summit. And in this summit, Crown Prince Abdullah, who was then the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia, but was kind of the de facto head of state at that time, he had visited Tehran, and it was the most senior visit of a Saudi official to Tehran since the 1979 revolution. And what was quite interesting about that moment, it gives you a sense of there's this body of water known as the Persian Gulf. I do stand by the Persian Gulf, by the way, and but there is this gulf between these countries that they don't really understand each other, to the extent that when it started snowing at that OIC summit, I remember some members of the Saudi delegation looking around and telling me, "Wow, we didn't know it snowed in Iran," and they don't have even a basic understanding of each other's politics, societies, cultures, or weather patterns, for that matter. And so we started to see that change. I was a reporter in Iran in the late 1990s, and what was striking is that I would get readouts from President Khatami's chief of staff about who he was talking to. And almost on a weekly or monthly basis, there was a conversation with Crown Prince Abdullah of Saudi Arabia. Khatami and Abdullah got along very well. And those of you in this room who know Saudi Arabia know that King Abdullah is a man who prizes his personal relations with leaders, to the point where if you get in on his bad side, as Nouri al-Maliki has in Iraq, it's very difficult to go to get back on his good side. And from my sources in Saudi Arabia tell me that King Abdullah had very good relations with Khatami as well as with Rafsanjani. So that period we started to see diplomatic activity, we started to see direct flights between Iran and Saudi Arabia, we started to see trade delegations, and then roughly around 2003, I'll call it the Iraq War interlude, we started to see the relations begin to fray again. And mostly it was related to the concerns, particularly in Riyadh, about Iran's opportunistic stance on Iraq. And as Prince Saud al-Faisal, the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia, articulated it in a 2005 speech at the Council on Foreign Relations, in which he said, we all came together to fight to get Iraq to overturn the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, and now we seem to have handed Iraq over to Iran without even a fight. And that was his basic argument in 2005, and we started to see tensions. Enter Mahmoud Ahmadinejad in 2005, and the bridge building moved to bridge damaging, the fence mending moved to fence cracking, and we've started to go back. We would also have to add the broader geostrategic battles between, again, a lot of this is Tehran versus Riyadh across Southwest Asia, in which both Tehran and Riyadh were on opposite sides of battle lines in Lebanon, in the Palestinian territories, in Iraq, and to some extent in Afghanistan as well. And so we are kind of back to where we were, but it's certainly not the bad old 1980s. It's not the 1980s in which the two sides, particularly Iran and Saudi Arabia, actually engaged in shooting during the tanker war of 1984 through 1987. So the question is, will this relative moderation that has been the culmination of the Rafsanjani era foreign policy hold in the Bahrain crisis? And I'll get to that in a moment. But I think the other relationship, I've talked a lot about the Iran-Saudi Arabia relationship. I think the other relationship that's important to focus on is the Iran-UAE relationship, particularly given the importance of Dubai as to some people call it, Iran's commercial lungs in many ways. Dubai is and was certainly the most important re-export center to Iran. It was, but no longer is, Iran's major trade partner. A series of sanctions, the United States, the work of Stuart Levy at the United States Treasury Department, and United Nations sanctions have made life more difficult for Iranian businessmen. Trade is down to about $6 billion a year, down from about $10 billion a year in 2009. So certainly there is an effect. There are something on the order of 8,000 Iranian businesses in the United Arab Emirates, some 400,000 Iranian residents living in Dubai, which leads the oft-told Iranian joke among Iranian merchants in Dubai is what is the best city in Iran? And the answer is Dubai is the best city in Iran. And so there is a sense that there is this powerful Iranian presence in Dubai, but certainly life has become more difficult for those businessmen. Now, when you look at the Iran-UAE relationship, you obviously have to think about the islands dispute, which remains simmering, the islands, the three strategic islands of Abu Musa, the Greater and Lesser Tombs. Thus far, it seems that the UAE is not taking any significant action to reclaim those islands, and they seem to be content with communiques and statements issued at GCC meetings. The Iran-Dubai trade is down, but it's still significant. But I think the more important piece of it is this generalized crackdown on Iranian banks, on Iranian businesses, on Iranian entities in Dubai that is affecting those merchants that are operating and also affecting the Iranian economy. There was a run on the Iranian rial a few months ago when Emirati banks refused to trade in rials. And the Iranian central bank had to intervene and buy up some of those rials. And one of the more interesting aspects, you all know, you've heard about these islands that Dubai is creating, islands in the shape of the world, and Palm Island, and all these. More recently, the former IRGC commander, Yahya Rahim Safavi, has started to make these islands an issue and started to say that these building of these islands has become a detriment to Persian Gulf security, Persian Gulf ecology, and we're starting to see those islands even being made an issue. So where do we stand on Iran-Bahrain? As you all know, there is a long-standing Iranian claim to Bahrain. You know, I won't get into the historical documents dating back to the 18th century, but broadly speaking, if I would recommend you, if you haven't read the diaries of Asadullah Alam, the chief of the royal court of the Shah of Iran, well, you'll see that the Shah of Iran actually in the late 1960s spent a considerable amount of his time and energy thinking about the Bahrain issue and the Bahrain question, ultimately ceding Bahrain and saying that Iran will no longer lay claim to Bahrain. Well, certainly that memo was not received by some hardline Iranian officials who occasionally will make claims on Bahrain. And the question is, but again, this is, you know, back to the whole issue of, is Iran a pragmatic actor or is an ideological actor? If you just go back a couple of years ago when a senior Iranian official, a senior newspaper editor and a former senior Iranian official said that Bahrain is still a part of Iran, 2 days later, Iran's foreign minister went to Bahrain and essentially apologized for that statement and said that, you know, we respect Bahrain's territorial sovereignty. Now, what happens now? Saudi troops are in Bahrain. UAE troops, UAE police forces are in Bahrain. The King of Bahrain has declared a state of emergency. They are implying that the protesters are being inspired by Iran. Now, those who know more about Bahraini Shiite movements than I tell me that these are, you know, internal indigenous movements that may have some links with Iran, but Iran is certainly not the driving force here in these actions. And if you were to listen to the statements of some of the leaders of Wafaq, the leading Shiite opposition party in Bahrain, these are not incendiary, fire-breathing statements. These are statements of officials looking for, opposition figures looking for space in Bahrain. And I've often said, and I've often told my Saudi friends and Bahraini friends, that if you begin treating Shiites a little bit more like citizens and a little bit less like fifth columnists, you know, some of these problems could potentially go away. And so this is, the question is, what will Iran do? In fact, I was talking about this with Hale Esfandiari, and I'll just close on this. It almost seems like they don't have to do anything. Would they send troops? That seems highly, highly unlikely for Iran to send in forces. You know, are there Iran, you know, intelligence operatives in Bahrain right now? Probably. You know, but there's Iranian intelligence operatives all over the Persian Gulf region, and they are intelligence operatives all over the region as a whole. So they're probably there. Are they in contact with, you know, members of Shiite opposition groups? Probably. Are the Shiite opposition groups taking directions from them? Probably not. And so the other advantage that Iran has is that, as we were talking, it's Nowruz. It's the Persian New Year coming up. And so for 2 to 3 weeks or so, government will be closed. So they won't be in a position where they actually have to make a lot of statements. They won't be in a position where the cameras will be in front of them and microphones will be in front of them, in which they'll have to make a lot of statements. And just the last point I'd like to make, however, is that when you compare Iranian state television in Persian language, and you compare that to the Iranian Arabic language television, Al-Alam TV, and you look at how Al-Alam television, the Arabic language television, is covering Bahrain, and you compare how the Persian language television is covering Bahrain, Al-Alam TV, the Arabic language, is all over the Bahrain story. It is talking with people on the ground. It is pointing out examples of people getting killed. It's going to hospitals and interviewing people in hospitals. And if you look at, I just pulled up the BBC monitoring from March 14th. And when you look at the Persian language program for March 14th on the BBC monitoring, the first 5 stories, the first story is Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei visiting an exhibit of strategic technologies. The second story, a video report on the aftermath of the earthquake in Japan. The third story is a report on the launch of the construction of a Persian Gulf bridge in southern Hormozgan province. The fourth story is a recap of the news headlines. The fifth story is a report of snowfall in different Iranian cities, and on until a story about the happiness that Nowruz causes for children. The first 10 stories, not a single Bahrain. Now, you go to Iranian Al-Alam TV, the first 10 stories are Bahrain, it looks like. Reporting a Bahraini opposition movement leader, Bahraini opposition MP, critical of Saudi troop arrival. So this is the sort of thing we're going to see. We're probably going to see Al-Alam TV making some noise. We'll see mid-ranking Iranian officials making some noise. We've already seen the Iranian foreign minister say that Bahrain ought not to use violence against peaceful protesters. Somewhere in the heads of these Iranian officials, there's not a hypocrisy chip, is there? You know that. But we'll see statements like that. But will we see a radical move on behalf of Iran? For example, the movement of troops, the movement of intelligence operatives in a significant way? Probably unlikely. So I'll end it right there.
Thank you. That's fascinating. Really fascinating about the different news coverage. Mark Katz is going to speak. He's now a senior fellow this year at the Middle East Institute and is working on a series on the Middle East and Russia. Very interesting, and I highly commend his. Do you have a blog? Is that they're posted? I get them.
Yeah, I just send it.
Oh, well, if you leave your email and he'll put you on his list. Go ahead, Mark.
Okay, well, thank you very much. First, I'd like to say what a great privilege and honor it is to be sitting up here with both Robin Wright and Hala Esfandiari. I've been an admirer of Robin's long before I met her. In the mid-1990s, I was writing a book on revolutions and revolutionary waves. I'm from a little town in California called Riverside, and my best friend's mom used to send me the articles from the Los Angeles Times that Robin wrote, not just the ones on the Middle East, but on everything. And she wrote on everything, on California and all kinds of fascinating things you did. And I just had developed a great admiration, and she sent these to me right up until she died in 2002. It was anyway. And Hala Esfandiari, I recently heard her give a talk on her book, My Prison, My Home, recounting her experience in captivity. And you know, she's amazing. I don't know if there's anyone else who can go through an experience like this and be funny in talking about it afterwards. She's my heroine, that's for sure. I don't think I could do nearly as well as she did under such circumstances. Anyway, I'd like to talk today a little bit about the Russian-Iranian relationship. As many of you know too well, I've been writing about this for a long time. The Russian-Iranian relationship has long been a very difficult one. I don't really want to go into the history of it at all. There's a brief overview of it in my piece on the Iran Primer. What I'd like to do is to focus on Russia and Iran since Obama took office in particular, and especially last year and this. You know, one of the great hopes that the Obama administration had for the reset in Russian-American relations was that Russia, you know, with improved Russian-American relations, Russia would do more to help us with Iran on the nuclear issue in particular. And in fact, in 2010, it seemed that these hopes were realized, that Russia joined with the U.S. And China and the other permanent members and most of the members of the Security Council in voting for increased sanctions against Iran this past June. You know, people weren't sure that this was going to happen. You know, the Russians and Chinese might block it, but the Russians indeed cooperated with this. And this past September, President Medvedev did something I think even more extraordinary. You know, several years ago, Russia agreed to sell Iran the S-300 air defense missile system. And this is something that the Israelis have been extremely unhappy about, as has the United States. The Israelis in particular, because, you know, they have indicated, some of their leaders, that that if all else fails, they may well attack in order to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons. And the fear was that with S-300s, that the Iranians would be able to degrade, if not render pointless any such attack. And so they were very, very fearful of this. Now, not unusually in the Iranian-Russian relationship, when Russia sells something to Iran, it sort of collects the money but doesn't necessarily deliver the product, or at least not immediately. And in fact, something like, I think $800 million was paid to Moscow, but the Russians hadn't been delivering. Now, normally what their practice is, and what I certainly predicted would have continued, is that they keep it vague, that they talk about technical difficulties, whatever those might be. But they indicate, of course, that they're on their way, but there are certain technical difficulties at the moment. But they always hold out the promise of delivery. This past September, President Medvedev came out and said, "We're not delivering them, period." And it was just it was really quite shocking, and in a certain sense, for the Russians to kind of give up on leverage like this, I would not have predicted that this happened. And of course, the Iranians were absolutely furious, both with the sanctions and with this decision. And it's really quite interesting, all these different Iranian top leaders making all kinds of predictions about what was going to happen to Russia if it annoyed Iran any further, that it was going to fall apart, that all these terrible things were going to happen, that Russia needed Iran just to stay together. And it was just so clear, and look what the Russians were doing to themselves, and this was awful. But obviously, the Obama administration, the West in general, and of course Israel was very, very happy about all this. But when we come to 2011, all this progress seems to have been reversed. Recently, President Medvedev has reverted to the old Russian position of stating that there's no proof that Iran's attempting to acquire nuclear weapons. No, not at all. And Foreign Minister Lavrov has said repeatedly that there should be no more sanctions on Iran, that sanctions have been played out. In fact, he's even talking about reducing sanctions. In other words, that now is the time to come to offer incentives to Iran to cooperate. And that the Russian position has backtracked. Now, why would this be? Now, it strikes me that there are a couple of factors that may have influenced this. One, I think, has to do with New START, the Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty. You recall that Presidents Obama and Medvedev signed this treaty last April. But there was a tremendous amount of doubt that it would be ratified by the Senate, requiring, obviously, 2/3 majority. It would require Republican cooperation, and there were many Republicans who stated their vociferous opposition to this treaty. And so in my view, I think one of the incentives that Russia had in cooperating with the U.S. on Iran last year was that it very much wanted the Senate to ratify the START treaty. The Senate duly ratified it in December, and lo and behold, the Russians, as is their wont, backtrack on this, that suddenly they don't need Senate approval right away, therefore they can be not so forthcoming on this. I think there is also another factor may have come into play, and that is the remarkable democratic uprisings that we've seen in the Middle East since the beginning of the year. And the Russian position on this has changed over the course of the past couple of months. When it was a question of just the Jasmine Revolution in Tunisia, they seemed to be pretty sanguine. In fact, President Medvedev even made a statement saying that, when leaders don't, rule badly, this is the kind of thing that happens, almost, sort of indicating their blessing for this. When it came to Mubarak in Egypt, well, they didn't seem quite so enthusiastic, but they didn't seem to be terribly upset by his falling from power either. But it's been a very different question altogether when it's come to Libya. And when it's come to Libya, we have seen both Presidents Medvedev and Prime Minister Putin going back to the kind of language that we heard Putin use after the Beslan incident. In other words, basically blaming the West on this, that Putin and Medvedev seem to have indicated that it is the West that is fomenting these democratic uprisings in the Arab world with the goal of bringing them to Russia, of changing the government in Russia, and of breaking Russia up. But of course, this is doomed to fail, this sort of plot altogether. And similarly, with regard to Iran, you'll remember that back in mid-2009, when the Iranian government declared that Mahmoud Ahmadinejad had won re-election on the first ballot by an overwhelming majority, the response in Tehran was the bursting forth of the Green Movement, that there are upward of, at one point, something like 2 million people may have been out demonstrating, and there was a great sympathy for this movement in the West, if not, of course, any support for it. The Russians, as soon as it was announced that Ahmadinejad had been reelected, they offered their congratulations, and that they basically made it clear that they opposed the Green Movement, that this was obviously a foreign plot. They opposed democratic revolution in Iran then. They opposed democratic revolution in Iran now. It's really quite interesting. In the Western press, you often see people worrying about how, we worry about in Iraq the spread of Iranian influence. Once that the U.S. leaves. In some Russian articles I have found, what they worry about is the spread of Iraqi influence into Iran. that somehow that the turmoil going on in Iraq will somehow spread into Iran, and then of course northward, and that the whole thing will be uncontrollable. Now, what would account for the difference? Why would Moscow be sanguine about democratic revolution in Tunisia and Egypt, but not about democratic revolution in Libya and Iran? And it strikes me that the reason may be that there is a differential geostrategic impact for Russia. In Tunisia and Egypt, the governments that were ousted were closely allied to the United States. Therefore, if the new governments are also closely allied to the U.S., it's not a change for Russia. But in fact, if these governments have some differences with America and the West, there might be some room, if perhaps not for Russian influence, certainly for more Russian business. And in many respects, I think that Russian foreign policy, in many ways, it resembles French foreign policy in the sense that really it's commercial policy was what they focus on more than anything else. So the change in Tunisia and Egypt doesn't hurt Russia, may help it. But it's a very different matter when it comes to Libya and Iran, that although obviously U.S.-Libyan relations improved during the George W. Bush administration, Russia and Libya have long had a good relationship. Now, it obviously fell by the wayside, as did so many of Russia's relationships with the Third World during the Yeltsin years. But Putin in particular paid quite a bit of effort to reviving that relationship. And, Gaddafi visited Moscow, Putin visited Tripoli. That what Putin has sought for Gazprom, for Russian petroleum interests, is a piece essentially of the Libyan market. In other words, that obviously Libya produces oil, but it appears that it also has natural gas, and Russia has a gas company, Gazprom, and they definitely want to get in there, before the West does, and so they wrote off all of Gaddafi's Soviet-era debt in exchange for Gaddafi agreeing to buy an equivalent amount worth of Russian products. So that sounds pretty good, and apparently he hasn't quite gotten around to it before the present difficulties. But they really regarded Libya as a place where they stood to gain. So if the new government if there is to be a new government in Libya, and that's increasingly in doubt, if it was different from Gaddafi's in terms of its foreign policy orientation, it was closer to America and the West, this would from the Russian point of view, this would be harmful to Russian interests, both commercial and geostrategic. And for Iran, this is even more the case, that for Russia, they have regarded the Iranian-American hostility as a boon for them. What they have long feared is Iranian-American rapprochement. They believe that if and when this happens, that the Iranians will essentially, well, forsake them, and that American and Western business will replace, whatever Russian business interests are there. And Iran is pretty rude to Russia even when it has hostile relations with America. Just think if Iran had good relations with America, how really rude toward Russia it probably would be. Also, what the Russians fear is that with an improvement in Iranian-American relations, America would work with Iran for Iran to become a alternative export route for Caspian Basin oil and gas. And this would really have disastrous implications for Russia, not only economically, but in terms of its influence in the Caucasus and Central Asia. So they're very, very fearful about the prospect of a democratic revolution in Iran. Okay, now, just wrapping up here. Now, I cannot prove that these two things that I have suggested, that start ratification, that the democratic uprisings are in fact responsible for the change in Russian behavior. What I do know is that Russian behavior has changed from 2010 to 2011. And there's one more thing I think that is clear, that if the Obama administration had hoped that in fact Moscow was coming around to Washington's way of thinking about Iran, that is simply not true at all. That in fact that the Russians simply do not share, have the same urgency about the Iranian nuclear issue that Washington and several of its Western allies do, nor are they willing to increase the sanctions regime as the Obama administration seems to want to do. And I just can't help closing by noting that Robin's success in getting all 50 scholars to produce the Iran primer is sort of akin to, organizing academics is often described as being similar to herding cats. But, I've never liked that expression. Thank you.
Pun, yeah. Mike Eisenstadt is one of the most prolific Middle East analysts in Washington, D.C. He is currently with the Washington Institute for Near East Affairs or Policy, and I'm sure you can go to WINEP's website and see and get many pieces. He has particular experience on the ground in Iraq, and it's added enormously, I think, to our understanding of what's going on to actually have someone with on the ground experience. So I hand over to Mike.
Well, we'll see. Anyhow, I just want to also thank you very much, Robin, for your introduction. And I just want to echo the comments by the other speakers to say what an honor it is to be here on the panel with both Hala and Robin, as well as Afshin and Mark. What I thought I would do today is, there's this ongoing debate now in light of recent events in the region, this Arab Spring or Second Arab Awakening, about whether Iran is the main beneficiary of these developments and whether Tehran's regional influence is on the rise as a result of these events and others. And I thought it would be useful to look at Iraq as both a case study and perhaps bellwether for the region that provides perhaps some tentative answers to these questions, or at least insight into, and I guess the way I would frame it is, Iraq is the country in which Iran has the greatest natural advantages. Long porous border, long-standing ties with key Shiite and Kurdish parties, religious and cultural affinities, and extensive trade and economic relations. And in light of that, therefore, have they been able to translate these natural advantages, into tangible achievements. And my short answer is that at best, after 8 years, their efforts have produced mixed results. And like the United States, they've learned the limits of their influence. Now, this might change in the future, especially with the U.S. drawdown, and if the United States leaves Iraq and there's no military presence after 2011, I think that will have an impact on the dynamic. But again, I wanted to look at this from the point of view of whether Iraq provides any insights into this regard. And by the way, let me just say, on the whole debate about the impact of ongoing change in the region, first of all, I think it's just way too early to say. I mean, to what impact. First of all, we have no idea how far this is going to go, how this is going to end up. So I think it's really fatuous to talk with any certainty about the outcome, what's going to happen, and whether Iran turns out to be a winner or a loser, or how the U.S. ends up coming out of this. I will say that if you look at the region in the long term, there's this kind of pendulum of influence in the region that swings back and forth. And we've had our high moments, in '91 after the end of the '91 Gulf War, 2003, and we've had low points. After '91, we had the Madrid and then Oslo Accords, Madrid peace Arab-Israeli summit, and Oslo Accords, Jordanian-Israeli peace agreement. Then you had the decline of American influence in the region as a result of sanctions fatigue on Iraq, rise of bin Ladenism. And then you had also in the region, you had the rise of the reform movement in Iran, the student protests of 1999. Again, the U.S. was on top in 2003, and then found itself mired in problems in Iraq and Afghanistan. You had a period in Lebanon where the March 14th movement, the withdrawal of Syrian forces, 2009 Iran election. So the pendulum goes back and forth, and right now I think the pendulum clearly is swinging in Tehran's direction. But again, this is a region characterized by an unstable disequilibrium, and I think that's a redundancy. But and it's in the midst of change, and I expect that the pendulum will swing back eventually as well. So let me just start with Iran's approach to projecting influence in Iraq. And they've taken, and this was the subject of the chapter that I wrote for the Iran Primer, and it's, after looking at this, it's very clear that they've taken a very sophisticated whole-of-government approach that employs all what we call the elements of traditional elements of national power: diplomatic, informational, military, and economic, plus some elements that are unique to Iran, such as their influence over the transnational Shiite clerical network. In the case of Iraq, their efforts to extend influence has entailed, first, assistance and support for their political allies there, both Kurdish and Shiite parties, support from militias and insurgent groups, and third, the use of soft power, in particular economic ties, their attempts to export revolutionary Islam, and propaganda / hearts and minds type of efforts. But I would argue that their implementation of this whole government approach has sometimes been very disjointed. First of all, one of their main goals, every time there's been an election since 2005, they've tried to unite Iraq's Shiite parties so that the vote is not split, and so that the result of the elections reflects the Shiite demographic weight in the country. Now, and they've not really been very successful in this regard. For instance, the last election, Maliki, ran on his own party list. It was only after the election that they eventually succeeded, after about 9 months, in finally getting the Shiites to come together and form a governing coalition with others as well. But what they've done, while trying to get the Shiites to work together, they've consistently tried to split off radical elements from their traditional partners, such as Badr or the Mahdi army. So you had, from Badr, you had Abu Mustafa Shibani, who had a EFP network that he ran for them, and Abu Mahdi al-Mohandes, who has a long established ties to Tehran. From Jam, you had Qais Khazali, who left for his own reasons, but Tehran has emerged to back him. And then Ismail Alami, who's Abu Dara, the Shiite Zarqawi. And now that the AAH is trying to enter the political process, it's contributed to the fragmentation of the Shiite political arena. So while trying to encourage unity, they've done things which have led to fragmentation. Secondly, as long as their partners have been in leading the Iraqi government since 2005, they've tried to support the Iraqi government while also arming militias that undercut the authority of the government. And at the same time, a lot of these militias have fallen into fighting with each other. So if you remember, there was a series of assassinations in southern Iraq in, I think, 2007 or so, involving police chiefs and governors. It was done with, some of these were done with weapons and EFPs that were provided by Iran for use against American forces, but they ended up using it against each other. And this has created a lot of headaches within the Shiite community and headaches for Iran as well to manage the relationship among its Shiite partners. And then while engaging in propaganda to win Iraqi hearts and minds, keep in mind that El Alam TV was set up on the eve of the U.S. invasion in 2003. I think there was a very smart move on their part, anticipating what was going to happen, and wanting to have a kind of a propaganda organ to influence the Iraqi listening public. While trying to engage in propaganda, they've also engaged in actions that have undermined these efforts and that have confirmed negative Iraqi attitudes towards Iran. And several examples. I mean, the dumping of produce and products in Iraq, which has, they've subsidized a lot of these exports, and they've also imposed tariffs, which makes it hard for the Iraqis to export to Iran. And this has prevented the recovery of Iraq's agricultural and manufacturing sectors and created a lot of resentment in Iraq. Also, the diversion and blocking of rivers, the Kalal River that flows into Wasit province and the Karun and Kharka rivers that flow into Basra province, has led to a process of salinization of the soil, degradation of agriculture in those areas in the Fao Peninsula, and on a local level, at least, that has created resentment against Iran. And then you had the Faqqa oil well incident, where they occupied for a short period of time in, I think, December 2009, this oil well that was slightly, the Iraqis say, inside their territory, which created a lot of anti-Iranian backlash. And then finally, you have the shelling of villages in the Kurdish region against Pejak guerrillas located there, which, on a local level, at least, has created, undermined their hearts and minds efforts. So I guess, what I'm trying to say is that they've invested a lot of effort in Iraq, but a lot of the stuff they have done has, in many ways, created as many problems as they've been able to resolve. Now, there might be a method to this madness. Part of this serves their purpose. Keeping the Shiites awake and divided is part of their overall policy. But I think it also creates a certain wariness among a lot of politicians who are not, the ones who are not in their pocket, that, there's a price you pay by having to rely on the Iranians for the mediation services, in the political arena and the like. And I think it accounts for the wariness. We saw ISKI in the efforts to form the government recently, for a historical decision, try to break with Tehran. Eventually it came back, but I think it's fed by this wariness of working with them for 8 years in very, and ISKI didn't need people, at least certain people in ISKI didn't need to learn this. They had been in Iran for 20 years and they learned it already from their presence there. But anyhow, it's complicated things for Iran. Now, going forward, Iran's main emphasis in the future will continue to be support for their political allies and the use of soft power, and there'll be diminished emphasis on support for militias and insurgent groups because, again, these groups cannot operate openly anymore. The Iraqi security forces don't allow them to do so, and as the U.S. leaves, their ostensible raison d'etre will no longer exist. So it'll be focused on their efforts in the political arena. I think will be assisted by the fact that you have a unstable and fractious ruling coalition in Iraq, which consists of parties that until just a couple of years ago were fighting each other. The Sadrs bolted from the last government that Maliki headed, and it remains, a possibility that, Muqtada Sadr has already set markers that he says he's given the government 6 months to improve delivery of services. Otherwise, they'll engage in nonviolent resistance, protests against the government. So the basis of a looming confrontation within the ruling coalition exists, and that puts the Iranians actually in a good position because they are ideally suited to act as mediators between these groups. So in a way, they're in the cat's seat in that regard. With regard to soft power, it's a much more complex picture. And again, with soft power, the way I use it, and I think the way the Iranians think about it, is it's basically all the non-kinetic elements of national power. It's not just, as Joe Nye says, it's not just the power of attraction, because they often use soft power in a very hard-nosed, hard way. I mean, the stuff they're doing that harms the Iraqi economy is very harmful. Has a very harmful long-term effect for Iraq. The dumping of produce and light manufactured goods and stuff like that. So soft power can be used in a very hard-nosed, tough-minded way, and it is by Iran. But it consists of several elements. First, reputation and image management. And in the context of Iraq, that really focuses on the triumphalist narrative that we hear throughout the region, that they're saying that basically history and God is on their side, their enemies are losing, you better hitch your wagon to us and not the United States or Israel. Although, again, these efforts to manage their image is often undermined by the ugly Iranian syndrome, where they often overreach and act in a high-handed way, especially with Arabs and in Iraq, and this has kind of made their effort at reputation and image management more complicated. On the economic level, they're going to keep efforts to keep. They're going to continue efforts to keep Iraq economically weak and dependent. They've used their investments also at the local level in the provinces to bolster local allies. People who are associated with ISKI and the like often have a competitive advantage in dealing with the Iranians, especially with regard to the religious tourism business. A lot of local Iraqis complain about this, that it's people who are well connected to ISKI and the like who often get the contracts, and this creates ill will and resentment. And also, the Iranians are also been trying to create relations of interdependence with their neighbors in order to bolster their deterrent relationship with the U.S. And this was very interesting, because I read an article by the, I think he's a former Rev Guard officer, who's the head of their passive defense organization, which is in charge of protecting Iran's strategic infrastructure. And he basically says, and let me just say, pipelines and electricity sharing agreements are mainly economically motivated. But for people in the security sector in Iran, it's also a way of creating the interdependence between Iran and its neighbors, most of whom have a relationship with the U.S., as a way of creating a lobby, in Washington against preventive action against Iran, with the idea being that if Iran gets bombed, well, Iran might shut off electricity to Iraq, or it might be disrupted, oil pipelines may not flow, and its pro-American neighbors might be hurt. So send the message to Washington. And again, Iran provides Iraq with 10% of their electricity. In some of the neighboring provinces, it's much higher. So it's mainly economic, the motivation for that stuff, but there's also a strategic dimension. And I'll be wrapping up in just a minute or two. Export of radical Islam. I think they're also situated very well. After Sistani passes away, they've been investing a lot of money, state funds, to support the co-optation of this transnational Shiite clerical network, which traditionally was based in Najaf, so that there are more people who are trained in Qom and who are espouse the official ideology of Valayat al-Faqih of the Islamic Republic. And this is one area where I think they've achieved a lot of successes. Although I'm not sure in Iraq because of the proximity, but in other places, certainly I think they'll be successful. Again, what happens after Sistani dies, I think, is a big question mark. And then finally, I mentioned propaganda. They've been working on this very hard in Iraq. But if you look at the polling data, again, ever since 2003, Iran has a very bad reputation in Iraq. All their efforts have not succeeded in changing that. But because of Iraqi politics is mainly elite politics, which occurs in the bubble of the IZ, the international zone, and behind closed doors, except during election time, public opinion doesn't really influence Iraqi politics. So it does have, around election time, it does have an influence, but the rest of the time, it doesn't. And this bad public image is the reason why I think Iran is constrained to wield their influence covertly more often than not, and to rely on soft power and special groups rather than acting overtly. I'll tell you what, I've gotten to the, I was going to talk about U.S. policy recommendations for the U.S. All I'll say is this. Bottom line, things might change dramatically after the U.S. withdraws. the conventional wisdom has been that Iranian influence in Iraq is self-limiting. Now, that might change with us gone. The dynamic might change, and it might, it's possible the dynamic will continue. And if Iran tries to fill the void created by the U.S., it'll create additional pushback. Or it might set in train a long-term process of Lebanonization. And I don't know which way it's going to go. I would argue it's important for the U.S. to remain engaged for the reason that as long as we are there to provide an alternative to Iran, that will strengthen those who had the courage in the past to push back against Iranian influence. So we need to remain involved both with regard to implementation of the Strategic Framework Agreement and on security level. And I don't rule out the possibility that after 2011, once we leave, the Iraqi government might ask us to come back in like what we had in Kuwait in the 90s, what they call these desert spring exercises where units rotate through. There's no permanent presence, but units keep rotating through, and we do retain a small residual military presence there, for that reason. And then finally, the last point I want to make is one thing that you ask military personnel who've served in Iraq, when you ask them, what is your most potent means of countering Iranian influence in Iraq? And they will tell you it's information operations. And what it is, it's basically the idea being that with regard to Iranian activities in Iraq, truth is the most potent or is our best ally, and sunlight is the best disinfectant. And if we put out information about what the Iranians are doing there, in order to provide more information to the Iraqis in this regard, that is the best way to ensure that Iranian influence there remains limited. On that point, I'll stop, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards.
Thank you, Mike, very, very much. I want to open it up to questions. If you'll please identify yourself and your affiliation, I'd be very grateful. Barbara? Yes.
Thanks. Barbara Slavin from the Atlantic Council. Guys, terrific presentations, all of you. Thank you very, very much. Really a lot to chew on. Mark, what has happened with Bushehr? Will it ever start? Is the fact that they've removed the fuel from it because of sabotage or something else? And do you think that the Iranians and the Russians might be rethinking the whole project in light of what's been happening in Japan? And for Mike, a little bit more, if you could, on Sadr. He appeared recently with Iyad Alawi. Was that just to sort of tweak the Iranians? I mean, is that partly a show? Is he a made man, as Ken Katzman has said? Is he now, entirely beholden to the Iranians, and he's just pretending to be a little bit independent? Thanks.
On Bushehr, the nuclear power plant that Russia has completed, in which finally the nuclear fuel was loaded, and after years and years of delay, it seemed to be just about ready to go on stream. Suddenly, there's been a problem, and the problem, at least in the Russian press, is they're blaming a bad pump, and that the pump was one of the ones that the West Germans, and I do mean West Germans, had provided back in 1975 or so. That, as the Russians pointed out, that in order to save money on the contract, the Russians agreed to use the materials that were present. And so, I mean, to me, it just seemed that, if you're going to use a 1970s era pump, this was bound to go bad, and that the Russians must have known it. And I can't believe that the Iranians didn't know it either. So, yet they still claim, both are claiming that, the project's still going forward. They've invested so much in this, and the Russians are hoping to build more nuclear power plants. And I don't mean to be flippant, but I don't think that they're going to be terribly embarrassed about what's happened in Japan. Certainly the Russians won't. Yes, Bushehr will go forward, but when, again, the indefinite future seems to be the best guess.
Yeah, I'll just say on Sadr, I think he defies easy categorization because he's I don't claim to have any special insights into his motivation, and anybody who does, you should wonder, I think. I mean, the first thing, I would mention, keep in mind when he was in Iran during the efforts to form the government, there was a report in Sharq al-Awsat, I believe, that he threatened to go to Lebanon if the Iranians kept pressuring him to form a government with Maliki, because he was refusing at that point. And eventually he came around. I don't know why, but it's and in the past, his relationship with Iran, I think it seems to have evolved. I mean, now he still is, has this base there. I don't know if he's still there, if he's still in Iraq right now, or whether he's going back and forth. But I think it's probably reasonable to assume that he, still has this base of operation in Qom, or wherever it is where he's been staying. So there is a certain degree of influence there. I mean, the fact that he's relies on the Iranians for safe passage and probably a certain degree of support for his armed militia. I think is an important consideration for him. So I think he's going to be careful about how he deals with the Iranians. On the other hand, also just a few years ago, in 2007, I think it was, he also threatened that if the U.S. attacked Iran, that the Mahdi army at the time would retaliate against the American forces in Iraq. So, he's sometimes colored as an Iraqi nationalist, but it's clearly there's an element of kind of Shiite universalism in his worldview. As a son of a cleric, and especially among this transnational clerical network, there is a greater degree of kind of transnational Shiite kind of fealty. I think he's probably looking at. I watched his speech when he came back to Najaf in January, and it's very clear. What's interesting in his introduction, they didn't introduce him as kind of a man of religion. It was as Mujahid. All these honorifics were, as a political leader and as a struggler and holy warrior. And so I think he's kind of trying to incorporate both elements of Hassan Nasrallah's populist model. Nasrallah is not a senior cleric, but he's a populist politician. I think that's the model Sadr is kind of aiming for. The bottom line, though, as long as he's going to be operating out of Iran, and as long as his militia depends on them, he has to be careful about his relationship with Iran. I'm not sure he's a made man. I just don't know. So.
Yes.
Hi, Michael Adler from the Wilson Center. Thank you all for your excellent presentations. I have a question for Afshin and Michael. What exactly has Iran been doing since the Arab Spring began? In what way has Iran moved assets or changed tactics to capitalize on the movements in the various countries? And how effective have they been, and what might they be waiting for in order to be more effective?
Sure. I think the important point about Iran's reaction to the Arab Spring has been its relatively muted reaction to Bahrain, whereas they were doing a lot of cheerleading with Egypt, which tells us something, doesn't it? It tells us that Iran has traditionally been a little bit more daring and a little bit more reckless when the problems have been far away, or when the countries are far away, than when the country is a neighbor like Bahrain. Remember how I showed you the difference between Arabic language Persian TV, which is directed at an Arab audience, and Persian language TV? Well, Persian language TV was all over the Egypt story. And certainly they have been very active rhetorically. Now, your question is movement of assets. I'm going to do something very un-Washington and un-pundit-like, and I'm going to say I don't know. It's very difficult to tell if they have moved in any assets into a place like Egypt or Tunisia. Now, and even if they tried, I think the one thing that's important to remember is that in a place like Bahrain, Iran has real historic influence, cultural influence, commercial influence, religious influence. In a place like Egypt and Tunisia, they simply don't have those historic, cultural, commercial links. And I would also argue in Yemen, they don't have the same kind of powerful links that they have in a Lebanon, in a Bahrain, in an Iraq. And I think but Michael raised a very good point when he said that to some extent, after these, as these uprisings take place and after the new order changes in Iraq and in Afghanistan, some people ask who won the two post 9/11 wars. And the provocative answer is that Iran has won the two post 9/11 wars because the geostrategic climate has shifted. It's not anything that they've necessarily done. The Taliban to their east, who they nearly went to war with in 1998. I was in Iran in 1998 when Iranian troops massed on the border after the Taliban killed 11 Iranian diplomats. Saddam Hussein to their west. Saddam Hussein never lost his antipathy to Iran. We recall his last words before his death by hanging was death to the Persians. And suddenly these two foes of Iran were knocked out courtesy of the U.S. military, and Iran's geostrategic position was strengthened. And yet Michael's point is very valid. They're very clumsy at times, when they go into these environments. And whatever goodwill that they had in the 2003, 2004, 2005 period in Iraq has largely been squandered. The soft power has not worked very well. Whereas, and just the last point is, I'm not so sure this is so good for Iran. An overthrow in Egypt, an overthrow in Tunisia. In one respect, it's actually helpful for them to have a U.S. allied autocrat with a security state that is allied with Israel, that represses its own people, because it's a much easier target, isn't it, for Iran than a successful democracy, and which is why, which obviously I'm not suggesting Egypt is a successful democracy right now, but the last point I'll leave you with is that when I was talking to an Iranian foreign ministry official about Iraq, and I said, what is your ideal outcome? And he was quite open about the fact that, well, a successful, prosperous, secular Iraqi democracy would be very dangerous to us. And so because there's the demonstration effect, there's all of that, and so I think that in places where Iran has historic, cultural, commercial, religious links, Iran will play a role in their post-republic or post-monarchy future. But in places where Iran doesn't have those links, they're just really limited in their reach.
I have nothing really to add to what Afshin said, because he said it better than I could have. But he reminded me of a point I wanted to raise in my presentation, which is oil competition. And this is an issue which I think in the future, and I'm not an oil industry expert or anything like that, but it's going to be increasingly a bone of contention, because Iraq has great aspirations, probably unrealistic expectations and aspirations to become a major oil exporter. Multiples of what they're talking about, 12 million barrels a day within a decade or so, which is probably not going to happen. But it is realistic to that they're trying to create a very favorable environment for foreign investment, which doesn't exist in Iran because of sanctions and also because of Iranian constraints in the past. So if Iraq becomes a major oil exporter in coming years, their interest will be maximizing exports by low prices. And traditionally, the Iranians are price hawks. They have a limited amount, and they want the highest price they could get for it. So, and Iraq also has limited export. There's a lot of bottlenecks in terms of their ability to export, and they're trying to make up for that in the south now. But this is a potential area for conflict in the future, where we'll see increasingly, if the oil industry, the Iraqi oil sector does pick up, this is, again, a potential source of friction between the two countries. So,
thank you. Yes, sir.
I'm Ahmed Qasim. You've talked about the near abroad. How about Turkey? And let me sort of also go east to Khorasan and China, because gas is my professional interest. And basically, while the exceptional empires got stuck at the peaks of the Hindu Kush, the celestial empires come round, and the pipeline is on the border. And my information is that it's only 1,000 kilometers from the Gulf to the border, and apparently there's money to talk about pipeline across, so no talk of LNG. And basically, all gas east of the Caspian will go to China and not to EU.
So what's your question?
What's happening with the Turks and the Chinese?
Okay.
In regard to Iran?
In regard to Iran, yes.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can take a stab at that. One thing that's happening in when I mentioned Dubai, Turkey is emerging as the alternative re-export center for Iran. And when you look at Turkish-Iran trade, they're growing dramatically, and some of that is some traders moving their re-export operations from Dubai to Turkey. Iran and Turkey, as you know, have a long-standing trade and commercial relationship. The vast majority of Iran's natural gas goes to Turkey. Iran has not been able to develop its liquid natural gas, as you know, mostly because of sanctions and the inability to attract the kind of investment that they need. The Iran-China relationship, I find, is a very interesting one, and the reason I do is because there's this almost this conventional view in Washington is that, well, China views Iran as a strategic partner, and this is a strategic relationship. And I would argue that for Iran, it's a very strategic relationship. For China, Iran is one of 30 to 35, countries around the world that is engaged in energy partnership with. And when you actually look at the real numbers, China signs a lot of big-ticket deals, but then they don't actually pour in the real money into Iran. And partly, they're playing a waiting game here. They want to sign the deals, they want to hold the concession, and then they want to see what the international environment is going to be like for them. And this is actually frustrating national Iranian oil company officials in Iran who want China to actually come in and pour the money that they promised that they're going to pour in. But so here's the reality, though. If you're Iran, and you look at, Michael mentioned the oil, Iran is producing about 3.8, million barrels per day, and that's on the decline. And why is it on the decline? Because they can't get the investments that they need for future production, right? And so who's investing in Iran right now in any significant way? It's only China, only China. There's not a single European multinational willing to invest in any significant way in Iran's upstream and its exploration and production. So it's only China. And is China pouring in the real money? No. They're pouring in little bits, little bits of money. And so if you're Iran, Ayatollah Khomeini, it's the irony of Ayatollah Khomeini's statement was neither East nor West. Well, Iran is very reliant on the East right now, very reliant on Beijing for the commodity that accounts for 80% of its hard currency earnings and 50% of its fiscal revenues. And that relationship is one that is not as strategic in China's mind as it is in Iran's mind.
Thank you. Yes, sir. And then in the back here. For the website, webcast.
Thanks. I'm James Steckert. I'm unaffiliated. What about the resolution? What relationship does Iran have to the resolution of the Kurdish problem within Iraq, particularly the oil resources around Kirkuk and that area?
Mike, you want to take that?
Yeah, this is an area actually which I don't follow very closely. It's just, this has been an ongoing source of tension, and it seems, I don't know what the current state of play is. I mean, that, this idea of a, petrochemical law is going nowhere, and it seems that, the central government has, kind of is willing to live with a certain degree of adhocracy in kind of the way that, the KRG has decided to do things. But I don't, beyond that, Iran has become a destination for oil exported from the KRG areas, some of it apparently from origins outside the KRG in other parts of Iraq. But so that has been a source of tension between the KRG and central government. Beyond that, though, I don't really have a great deal of insight. I don't know if the other panelists do, but I don't follow that really closely.
In the back.
Yes. Could you look
Can you
eastward?
identify yourself, please?
My name's Matthew, also unaffiliated. Looking east across the Baluchistan border at Iran's relations with Pakistan, and also through the Shia cleric influence at Muslim populations in India.
Yeah. Okay. The Shia clerical influence of Muslim populations in India, I'll leave that to someone who knows, more about that than I do. What I can say is that in Pakistan, when you see these kind of sectarian battles taking place in places like Karachi and other places, and I have had conversations with Iranian officials about this, one of the things that they often tell me is that they don't like getting involved in sectarian battles. One of the misperceptions of Iran is that it plays a Shiite sectarian card. Iran likes to view itself as a pan-Muslim power. This is how it projects itself. Now, whether it is successful or not remains to be seen, but you can go back to Ayatollah Khamenei's speeches, and you won't see Shiite sectarianism in those speeches. You will see statements about the pan-Islamic ummah. And so, now, having said that, you will find on an infrastructure level, on a logistics level, you will find all embassies in Iran, all Iranian embassies, wherever they may be, offering funding to Shiite mosques, to Shiite cultural centers, to Shiite education centers, and that sort of thing. So you will find that sort of thing goes on, but on a macro level, you see a lot less of that. And then Iran's relations with Pakistan. That's a very interesting relationship because, on the one hand, Pakistan is home of probably one of the more significant border threats to Iran, the Jundullah army, and there is a lot of concerns within Iran about how much the ISI, Pakistan's Inter-Service Intelligence, is involved with the Jundullah. In many ways, Pakistan and Iran were on opposite sides in Afghanistan, and despite the fact that there's reports about Iran's flirting with the Taliban today, the last thing Iran would like to see is a Taliban back in power in Afghanistan. So it's a relationship that also has commercial aspects. Back to the question of gas. Iran and Pakistan have talked, at least for about 20 years now, about a gas pipeline. And again, and finally, it seems like there's some movement. Maybe you can tell us, it finally seems, okay, there's more movement in the rhetoric then, let's put it that way. One of the things that you do when you follow Iran's gas and oil industries is you can look at the trajectory of statement announcing big oil deal. 6 months later, statement announcing big oil deal has a snag. 1 year later, statement announcing big oil deal, major parties pulling out, and this Pakistan gas pipeline has been in talks for 20 years. So this is it's sort of a broad way to answer your question, that Iran doesn't like to play Shiite sectarian politics on a grand level. They much prefer to see themselves as more of a pan-Islamic power.
Thank you. We're running out of time, so I'll take one and those two together, and then we'll let each one of them wrap up with a comment.
Thank you. Benjamin Tua, independent analyst. Moving west, against the background of the rather impressive success of the Stuxnet virus and the Israelis extending of the critical timeline for the Iranian nuclear program to 2015, and possible Israeli concerns that we might, quote, rush to embrace Ahmadinejad, similar to some of the Russian concerns. I wonder if you all might comment on possible or perceived shifts in the Iranian-Israeli relationship.
All right, and let's take the last question in the back at the same time.
Hi, thank you for your thoughtful comments and research. My name is PFC Arrington. I'm with the Army Civil Affairs team located in College Park, Maryland, currently. My question to you is, and you mentioned it just briefly a moment ago, what are the Iranian interests in outcomes and events in Afghanistan? And could we see any situation where Iranian weapons would enter into the stream in events in Afghanistan like they were in Iraq? Thank you.
Let's go all the way down the panel and with answers to questions and final thoughts.
Okay, sure. Shifts in the Iran-Israel relationship. It's an important one. It's not an easy one, because I've often said that when it comes to there's three pillars of the Islamic Republic of Iran in the 1979 revolution, and one of those pillars is this sort of sense of anti-Americanism, at the sort of political elite level, which hasn't really filtered into the population, as you've all read the stories about how Iran has one of the most pro-American populations in the region. The second pillar, I would argue, is this its tough stance on Israel, on representing Palestinian aspirations, quote unquote. And the third, actually, I often said, is the hijab. Yeah, and the veiling of women. It's tough to walk back any of these pillars without discoloring the Islamic Republic in a way. And so I don't see any detectable shifts in Iran's position on Israel. So when it comes to now, by the way, it is worth noting, again, we go back to the bad old 80s. In the 80s, Iran actually did have a continued trading relationship with Israel. When you go back and you read the statements of Israeli officials at the time, there was a lot of statements, quotes from Shimon Peres and others saying, well, Iran's not too bad, don't worry about them, they'll moderate. And so it would be interesting if there's a shift in the Israeli perception of Iran. I don't know enough about that. And then the Iranian interests and outcomes and events in Afghanistan. I think broadly speaking, Iran's interests in the events and outcomes in Afghanistan and Iraq are similar. They want a government that is friendly to Iran, that does not in any way threaten Iran, particularly in Afghanistan. They don't want a government that offers Pakistan and Saudi Arabia strategic reach on their border, which is essentially what the Taliban government did offer them. They want geostrategic space. And if you look at the two post 9/11 wars, and if you look at who's in power in Afghanistan and in Iraq, and you see many of those senior officials spent some of their formative exile years in Iran, more so among the Iraqis than the Afghans. But Iran, throughout the Taliban years, was supporting the Northern Alliance, and in alliance, by the way, with Russia and India in supporting the Northern Alliance. So I think on a broad level, this is sort of what they want. They don't want an Afghanistan that is particularly successful, prosperous, a democratic state either. Because I remember I was in Iran, and what was it, in 2004, when there was Afghan elections, or 2003, and people on the streets of Iran were saying, wow, look at them, even the Afghans are holding what looks like free and fair elections, and they don't want that sort of thing. They don't want that kind of demonstration effect. And then the last point I think that's worth making is that in terms of Iran and its sort of regional position right now, I would argue that Iran is as strategically isolated as it has been in its modern history. Iran doesn't have a single significant strategic ally to come to its aid in the event of a shooting war. Iran is not a member of a significant strategic security alliance. After all, Turkey is a member of NATO. Iran's so-called friends are not the friends that have the kind of weapons that Iran could find useful in the event of a significant shooting war. So what Iran has been good at is opportunistic scavenging for when events move in certain directions. Iran has been good at that sort of opportunistic scavenging. And this argument that Iran will benefit as Egypt and Tunisia and others become more democratic because the populations of those countries tend to be more sympathetic to the Iranian position. I have time for that argument, certainly, but that will last, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years until, as Michael pointed out, Iran sort of acts in a clumsy manner, and this fascination with Iran, this fascination with Ahmadinejad among those streets will wear off. I can already tell you, when I was traveling in Cairo just a few years ago, it was a good way to get a free taxi ride, to say that I'm from Iran, because the Cairo taxi drivers were loving Ahmadinejad. They were loving the way he stood up to the West. They were loving all of that. But I would predict that 3 or 4 years from now, I'm not going to get free taxi rides anymore.
Mark, any
All
final
right.
thoughts?
Well, just picking up on Afshin's comment on Afghanistan, I don't think the Iranians need to worry too much that it's going to be a democratic, prosperous country anytime soon. But more seriously, I think that the situation in Afghanistan in the long term also provides another reason for Russia not to get too tough on Iran on the nuclear issue. As Afshin mentioned, that during the 1990s, before 9/11, India, Russia, Iran all worked to support the Northern Alliance against the Taliban. The U.S. apparently is going to be leaving Afghanistan by the end of 2014, and I believe that these three countries will all have the same interest. They don't have to love each other, or even the equivalent, whatever the Northern Alliance actually is. But I would think that the Taliban is a real threat. If it comes back to power, they can cause problems in Central Asia. They can cause problems in Russia itself, not to mention in India or in Iran. This is a real threat, and I think that for Russia and Iran, this is a far more of a common interest. Whereas an Iranian nuclear weapon, in Russia, rightly or wrongly, they can contemplate this far more calmly than the West can. That they think that it might well happen, and that if so, it's the end of the world. And they don't quite understand why the U.S. is so hysterical about it, considering that this isn't nearly as bad as far as they're concerned as a nuclear-armed Pakistan. That's a real problem as far as they're concerned. This is a country that is absolutely uncontrollable and is far more hostile to them. So I think that Afghanistan will also, in other words, especially as the U.S. draws down from Afghanistan, I think what we're going to see is Russia seeing Iran and India as vital partners to contain the Taliban there. And there's not going to be much appetite, I think, with regard to the nuclear issue to pressure Iran on this. Thank you.
I'll just be very quick with a few telegraphic bullet points. Stuxnet, I think there's been a lot of hype. We don't really understand what's happened, although it seems that it was probably less effective than had been hoped. And what it succeeded in doing was slowing the increase in production of uranium, low-enriched uranium, rather than slowing it down. So they're flat now rather than going on the increase with the addition of centrifuges. So there might be other things that are going on that we don't know about that might be slowing the program down, but maybe less there than meets the eye with Stuxnet. With regard to Afshin's point about this kind of emphasis on Shiite Islam, on Islam, with in an undefined way, I agree with that. But I would just say, if you look at their tactical and behavior in Iraq, they supported both the most sectarian Shiite elements who were involved in the worst kind of atrocities in 2007, as well as, and this is yet to be looked at in a detailed way, but I know people are doing research on this, the relationship with the Zarqawi and other Al-Qaeda Iraq people. There is a relationship there. We don't know a lot about it, but people are doing research on this, and I look forward to seeing what shows up from there. With regard to their empty promises, this has been an issue. I mean, they've earned themselves a very good reputation of promising very long. Remember what Petraeus says: promise little and deliver a lot. And the Iranians consistently do just the opposite. And this has happened in Iraq. And I think the Iraqis have learned to have very realistic expectations as to what they can expect from the Iranians as a result. Arab attitudes towards Iran, I would just simply plug a piece by a colleague of mine, David Pollack, who wrote a piece in foreignpolicy.com last September, What Arabs Really Think About Iran, which kind of runs against the conventional wisdom that, about Ahmadinejad and Iran's popularity on the Arab street, which shows actually, except for one Zogby poll, there's a whole bunch of other polls which show what you'd expect in the conventional wisdom, that Iran really isn't that popular on the Arab street, and they're not really looking forward to Iran producing a nuclear weapon. I urge you to read that. My final comment will be about Iran's allies. There's a great quote, I think it was Khalid Mishal from Hamas visiting Tehran. This was a couple of years ago, 2006, 2007, and he's talking to students, and they asked him, what will you do if Israel attacks Iran? And he says, brothers, I will pray for you. So anyhow, I think that I'll end it on that point.
Thank you very, very much. Please join me in thanking Afshin, Mark, and Mike.